The whisper of the wind. The wind, a constant, abrasive companion in the desert, shifted its song to a mournful sigh as Naichi knelt beside the makeshift cradle. The baby, barely a handful of life, swaddled in a tattered blanket, whimpered softly, a sound that pierced the vast silence more acutely than any coyote's cry. He dabbed a wet cloth, painstakingly wrung from his meager water skin, onto her feverish forehead. Her skin, so pale against the dark fabric, felt like sun-baked earth. 2 days he had carried her, 2 days since he found her in the skeletal remains of a wagon, 2 days of a relentless internal battle. His people, the Ande, would never understand. A white child, a Bilagana infant, was a curse, a harbinger of more strife. Yet he could not leave her. He straightened, his gaze sweeping across the undulating landscape of mesquite and rock. The sun, a brutal eye in the sky, was beginning its slow descent, painting the western horizon in hues of fiery orange and bruised purple. His destination, the distant, shimmering outline of Fort Bowie, felt both impossibly far and dangerously close. The fear of what awaited him there was a cold knot in his gut, but it was overshadowed by the primal urge to protect this fragile life. "She needs more," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. He meant water, real food, a softness he could not provide in this unforgiving wilderness. He remembered the small, almost imperceptible tremor in her tiny hand when she'd gripped his finger yesterday. A flicker of trust, perhaps. Or simply the instinct of a helpless creature. He nudged a small fire with a stick, coaxing a few meager flames from the dried brush. The aroma of simmering sage tea, a desperate attempt to soothe her fever, wafted on the breeze. He watched the baby, her breathing shallow, her eyes fluttering open briefly to reveal irises the color of a summer sky, before closing again. He thought of his own lost children, ghosts that haunted the edges of his vision. This child, so different, yet so utterly vulnerable, stirred something he had long believed to be dead within him. A sudden snap of a twig nearby brought him instantly to his feet, hand going to the hilt of his knife. The wind, for a moment, held its breath. Then, a jackrabbit, startled by his movement, bounded away into the deepening shadows. He sank back down, heart hammering against his ribs. Every shadow was a threat, every rustle, a potential ambush. He was a man caught between worlds, an Apache warrior carrying the future of his sworn enemies, heading towards a place where he was seen as nothing but a savage. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He looked at the baby, her small chest rising and falling with agonizing slowness. "We will make it," he whispered. The promise, a desperate prayer against the vast indifference of the desert night. We must. A desert bloom. The sun, a merciless forge, beat down on Nahimana as he traversed the arroyo. The air shimmered above the baked earth, and the only sound was the crunch of his moccasins on sun-bleached pebbles. 2 days since he'd found the tiny bundle, swaddled in a surprisingly clean, if blood-stained, blanket. The memory of the abandoned wagon, ransacked and silent, still pricked at him, and the wails that had led him to the infant, a sound so out of place in the vast, unforgiving landscape. He paused, shielding his eyes with a calloused hand, scanning the horizon. The distant mountains, jagged teeth against the pale sky, offered no comfort. His water skin was lighter than he liked, and the small pouch of dried jerky he'd salvaged from the wagon was nearly empty. The baby, nestled securely against his chest in a sling woven from his own tunic, stirred. A tiny whimper escaped her lips. "Soon, Nizuni," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. He offered her a corner of the blanket, hoping the fabric would soothe her dry mouth. He'd tried to feed her the watered-down jerky, but she'd gagged. His own mother's milk, he mused wryly, was long gone. He knew what lay ahead: Fort Defiance, a place of barbed wire, suspicious eyes, and men with rifles. His heart hammered a tribal rhythm against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave this pale, whimpering burden where she belonged, with her own kind. But the image of her small, helpless face, her eyes wide and trusting, had rooted itself deep within him. He pushed on, the thought of the fort a distant, terrifying beacon. He pictured the reaction he would receive: a lone Apache, carrying a white child. He could almost hear the accusations, the cries of "kidnapper," "savages." His jaw tightened. He wasn't a savage. He was a man, and he had found a child who would have surely perished. Later, as the sun dipped towards the western rim, painting the sky in fiery hues, he spotted a faint trail. Not an animal track, but the unmistakable imprint of a shod horse. He knelt, examining it closely. Fresh. He knew the risk of encountering anyone out here, especially near the fort. He could hide, wait for nightfall. But the baby coughed, a dry, rasping sound. He couldn't afford to wait. He took a deep breath, the taste of dust and desperation filling his mouth, and followed the trail. The faint scent of wood smoke, carried on the evening breeze, confirmed his fears. He was closer than he thought. The choice was made. He tightened the sling, ensuring the baby was secure. He would face whatever came. His people had a word for it: Hojo Nasha Du, may I walk in beauty. Today, he would walk with courage. The long walk home. The sun, a molten coin, dipped below the serrated horizon, stretching skeletal shadows across the parched earth. Nayland, a tiny bundle against his chest, stirred, a soft whimper escaping her lips. His own mouth felt like sun-baked clay, a ceaseless ache mirroring the thrum of his pulse. 3 days had bled into 3 nights since the ambush, 3 days of unyielding progress, yet redemption remained a whispered promise on the wind. He shifted the worn deerskin sling, feeling her minuscule weight, the fragile warmth radiating from her small form. Hunger, a predatory beast, gnawed at his gut, but his purpose was sharp and singular: her survival. That morning, he'd fed her the last of his dried berries, a pulped offering on his fingertip. She'd suckled weakly, her eyes, the color of a summer sky, wide and guileless. A sudden, piercing cry tore through the encroaching stillness. Nayland. He halted, his gaze sweeping the desolate expanse. A hawk, a fleeting ink blot, scribbled circles overhead. He lowered himself to a crouch, his body a shield, hand instinctively seeking the worn knife at his hip. Though too late for most predators to venture forth boldly, the desert teemed with unseen perils. He scanned the arroyo ahead, its dry bed a tempting shortcut, yet also a coiled trap. "Hush, little one," he rumbled, a low current of sound. He began a lullaby, his mother's mournful melody of stars and night spirits. Nayland quieted, her small hand reaching to ensnare his finger, her grip surprisingly tenacious. He resumed his journey, each step a deliberate act of will. The sand, still radiating the day's heat, whispered beneath his moccasins. He saw again the horror-stricken faces of the settlers at the burned homestead, the acrid stench of smoke and death clinging to the air. He remembered the small, crying bundle unearthed from the cellar. A white child, one of the invaders. A child he was now irrevocably bound to protect. A faint, metallic chime rippled across the distance. Nayland's head snapped up, her azure eyes wide with curiosity. He froze, every sense on high alert. Civilization, or something masquerading as it. He ducked behind a cluster of thorny ocotillo, peering through the spiky branches. A plume of dust, burgeoning and ominous, climbed against the dwindling light. Riders. Many of them. His heart hammered a desperate rhythm against his ribs. He had brought her this far. He would not fail now. Shadows of Oakhaven. The oppressive stillness of Oakhaven pressed in on Tal, a stark contrast to the vast, open spaces he called home. He clutched the swaddled bundle tighter, the baby's soft breaths, a fragile rhythm against his chest. The main street, a muddy scar bisecting the cluster of ramshackle buildings, was deserted. Curtains twitched in shadowed windows, eyes like slivers of flint tracking his every hesitant step. He could feel their scrutiny, a palpable weight on his shoulders. A lone figure emerged from the general store, a grizzled man with a shotgun cradled in his arm. "Evening, stranger," the man grunted, his voice laced with suspicion. "Lost your way?" Tal stopped, his gaze steady. "I seek assistance for this child." He held up the baby slightly, revealing the pale, innocent face. A gasp, thin and sharp, escaped from one of the darkened windows. The man's eyes narrowed, sweeping over Tal's worn buckskins, then lingering on the infant. "Where'd you come by a white baby, Apache?" The word, a brand, hung in the air, heavy with accusation. She was abandoned. Tal replied, his voice calm, though a tremor of unease ran through him. He knew the risk he was taking, the ancient fear he was stirring in these people. In the desert, alone. Another figure, a woman with a severe bun and a faded apron, appeared beside the storekeeper. Her eyes, though wary, held a flicker of something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or a nascent compassion. "Abandoned, you say?" she murmured, stepping closer, her gaze drawn to the baby's tiny, grasping fingers. Before Tal could elaborate, a commotion erupted from the saloon. A man, red-faced and reeking of whiskey, stumbled out, pointing a trembling finger. "It's one of them! He's got a white child!" Panic, swift and brutal, rippled through the street. Doors slammed shut. A low growl rumbled from somewhere, like distant thunder. Tal's hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt, but he knew violence here would seal the child's fate as well as his own. He needed to make them understand, to see beyond the color of his skin, to the life he held in his arms. "She needs a doctor," Tal stated, his voice cutting through the rising tide of fear. "She's not well." He felt the baby stir, a faint cough escaping her lips. It was a gamble, a desperate plea to their humanity, if any remained. The woman by the store hesitated, her eyes flickering between the baby's frail form and the growing anger on the street. The choice, Tal realized, rested on a knife edge. The hunter becomes the hunted. The desert night, usually a comforting blanket of stars and distant coyote song, now pressed in on Kian, thick and suffocating. He gripped the smooth, cool wood of his rifle, its weight a familiar anchor against the rising tide of unease. The tracks he'd been following, faint but unmistakable, had led him deep into a labyrinth of sandstone mesas, their shadows stretching like skeletal fingers across the moonlit sand. This wasn't a renegade Apache band, as he'd first assumed. The boots, the sporadic cigarette butts, the remnants of canned goods. These were white men, and not the usual prospectors or trappers. A twig snapped, impossibly loud in the stillness. Kian froze, his breath catching. He'd been so focused on the trail, on the infant swaddled safely in the sling against his chest, that he'd allowed himself to be careless. He cursed his momentary lapse in judgment. The baby, blessedly, remained asleep, a tiny bundle of warmth and innocence against his rapid heartbeat. He flattened himself against a cold rock face, his eyes scanning the gloom. The air, once crisp, now carried the faint, acrid scent of stale tobacco and something else, something metallic, like old blood. This wasn't a simple pursuit. This was a trap. He'd become so accustomed to being the hunter, the one who stalked and observed, that the shift in roles felt like a physical blow. A low whistle, barely audible, echoed from the canyon ahead, not an animal, but a human mimicry. Kian's jaw tightened. He knew that call. He'd heard it used by cavalry scouts, a signal for a perimeter check. They were encircling him. His mind raced, calculating distances, escape routes, the odds. He clutched the baby closer, the soft swaddle, a stark contrast to the hard reality of their predicament. He couldn't fight his way out, not with the child. His only option was evasion, to melt back into the desert, to become as silent and elusive as a shadow. He began to move, not along the obvious trail, but up a narrow, crumbling crevice, his moccasins finding purchase on almost invisible footholds. The wind, which had been still, now picked up. A whispering Confederate. He heard shouts then, closer this time, and the distinctive clink of metal against rock. They were closing in. He risked a glance back. Silhouetted against the moonlight, at the mouth of the canyon, were 4 figures. Too many. He pressed on, the baby's rhythmic breathing a fragile counterpoint to the pounding in his ears. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, and the stakes had never been higher. A tent stand. The dust, a fine ochre powder, swirled around Naichi's ankles as he paused at the edge of the town. Frontier, they called it. A loose collection of mismatched timber and canvas, smelling of wood smoke, stale whiskey, and unwashed bodies. The baby, nestled in the woven cradleboard on his back, stirred, letting out a soft whimper. He adjusted the sling, a familiar comfort, despite the unfamiliar burden. A group of men, burly and unshaven, spilled out of the saloon, their raucous laughter abruptly cut short as their eyes fell upon him. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, like the heat shimmering off the corrugated iron roofs. Naiche felt the familiar prickle of apprehension, a sensation he hadn't fully shaken since finding the child. He had faced armed warriors with less trepidation. Well, what have we here? A man with a drooping mustache, a star pinned to his vest, stepped forward. His hand, gnarled and thick-fingered, rested casually on the butt of a revolver. "An Apache! In Prosperity Creek!" And with a bundle. His gaze, cold and assessing, flickered to the cradleboard. Naiche's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of their stares, 100 invisible needles pricking his skin. "I bring this child," he said, his voice low, steady, a deliberate counterpoint to the rising tension. He spoke the few English words he knew, practiced painstakingly in the long, silent trek across the desert. White child. Lost. The mustached man, the sheriff perhaps, exchanged a glance with the others. A low murmur rippled through the group. "Lost, you say? And you, an Apache, just happened to find her?" His tone was laced with suspicion, each word a barb. "She was alone," Naiche replied, his eyes unwavering. He knew the risk he took, stepping into this den of distrust. He could turn and melt back into the desert, leaving the child to whatever fate awaited her here. But the image of her tiny, helpless face, covered in dust and tears, had etched itself into his soul. A woman, her face etched with worry lines, pushed through the men. "Let me see, Sheriff. Is it little Alice?" Her voice was thin, reedy, filled with a desperate hope. The sheriff held up a hand, stopping her. "Stand back, ma'am. We don't know what this redskin's up to." He took another step towards Naichi, his hand tightening on the revolver. The sunlight glinted off the metal, a stark, unwelcome sparkle. Naichi braced himself, his senses on high alert. The dry earth beneath his worn moccasins felt solid, yet precarious. He could feel the baby's small, steady breath against his back, a fragile warmth in the gathering chill of their animosity. This was the moment. A mother's recognition. The dust swirled around him, an ochre veil blurring the distant outlines of the fort. Nayland clutched the bundle tighter against his chest, the infant's soft sighs, a fragile counterpoint to the thrumming tension in his own veins. Each step felt like a drumbeat, echoing the warnings of his elders, the whispers of his own doubts. This was not his world, these stone walls and strange men with their harsh voices and even harsher laws. But the warmth against him, the tiny hand that sometimes fisted his buckskin, propelled him forward. He had made a promise, not just to himself, but to the spirit of the desert that had yielded this life to his care. A sentry, rifle cradled, squinted down from the watchtower. Nayland felt the prickle of scrutiny, the silent judgment. He kept his gaze steady, meeting the man's eyes without challenge, without fear. The gate creaked open, revealing a dusty courtyard where wagons sat like beached whales and soldiers moved with a restless energy. A woman, her face etched with worry lines and her hair pulled back in a severe bun, stood near the fort's entrance, her eyes scanning the new arrivals. Nayland walked directly towards her, the infant's face just visible from within the swaddling. The woman's gaze snagged on the bundle, her breath catching. Her hand flew to her mouth. A silent gasp. He could see the recognition dawning, a slow, agonizing bloom of hope and disbelief. He paused a respectful distance away, allowing her space, yet offering the child. "She is well," he said, his voice a low rumble, the English words feeling awkward on his tongue. He held the baby out slightly, the intricate beadwork of the cradle board catching the afternoon light. The woman took a tentative step, her eyes wide, glistening. "Elizabeth?" she whispered, the name a fragile question. Her fingers, trembling slightly, reached out, not for the baby, but for the tiny, embroidered blanket peeking from the folds. It was a simple pattern, a small bluebird, but its familiarity struck her with the force of a physical blow. A choked sob escaped her lips. Nayland watched her, a silent observer of a pain he could only guess at. He had seen grief before, but this was different, mixed with an overwhelming flood of relief. The baby, as if sensing the shift in emotion, stirred, opening her eyes. They were the color of the desert sky at dawn, a pale, startling blue. The woman's gaze locked onto them, and then, with a choked cry that was almost a keen, she reached, her arms encircling the child, pulling her close. The embrace was fierce, desperate, as if she feared the desert would snatch her back. Tears streamed down her face, falling onto the baby's wispy hair. He had done what he set out to do. The promise was fulfilled, hero of Oakhaven. The dust devils danced their usual slow waltz across the parched plains surrounding Oakhaven, but today they were largely ignored. Every eye in the small settlement was fixed on the figure approaching from the west, a silhouette against the setting sun. Naiche, the Apache tracker, walked with a deliberate, unhurried pace, the bundled form in his arms a stark, almost sacrilegious contrast to his hardened warrior's frame. A hush fell, thicker than any desert dust, as he drew closer to the hastily erected barricade. Sheriff Brody, his face a roadmap of worry lines, stepped forward, his hand hovering near the Colt holstered at his hip. "Naich?" he rasped, his voice tight. "What in God's name have you brought us?" Naichi stopped just outside the barricade, the scent of fear and stale wood smoke reaching him. He shifted the baby gently, her small, pale face a beacon in the dusk. "A child," he stated, his voice low, a gravelly murmur against the wind. "White, alone, abandoned." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Martha, the town's elderly midwife, pushed her way to the front, her eyes, usually sharp with judgment, now wide with a mixture of shock and maternal concern. "Abandoned? Out there?" She reached a trembling hand towards the bundle, but Naiche instinctively recoiled. "She is weak," he said, his gaze sweeping over the wary faces. "She needs care, food." He looked directly at Brody, his dark eyes unwavering. "She is one of yours." Brody swallowed hard. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Whose child? And why bring her here? The town had long been a refuge for those escaping pasts, a place where questions were rarely asked. But this was different. This was an Apache, bringing a white infant, a stark reminder of the volatile frontier they inhabited. Jedediah, the saloon owner, a man whose piety was as thin as his hair, stepped forward, a Bible clutched in his hand. "This is an abomination, a heathen bringing this into our blessed town." His voice cracked with a manufactured righteousness. Naichi's jaw tightened. He ignored Jedediah, his focus remaining on Brody. "She will die if she stays out there. She will die if you leave her here." He held out the baby, a gesture of profound trust and vulnerability. Martha, her resolve stiffening, pushed past Jedediah. "Give her to me, Naiche." Her voice was firm, cutting through the rising tide of fear. "I'll see to her." She gently took the infant, her calloused hands surprisingly tender as she cradled the tiny bundle. The baby stirred, a soft whimper escaping her lips. Brody watched Naiche, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. He saw not just a tracker, but a man who had risked everything, crossed an invisible line, for a helpless child. The hero of Oakhaven, he realized, wasn't the one with the badge or the loudest voice, but the silent warrior standing before them, offering salvation in the most unexpected form. The decision was made. "Let them pass," Brody commanded, his voice ringing with newfound authority. "And find Mrs. Henderson. The child needs milk." Silent departure. The dawn painted the eastern horizon in bruised purples and fiery oranges, a spectacle that usually brought a sense of awe to Chaitin. Today, it felt like a cruel mockery. He moved with a practiced quietness, bundling Ilara in the softest rabbit skins he possessed. Her small fists, still clenched in sleep, were a poignant reminder of the impossible choice he faced. The scent of wood smoke, faint from the dying embers of their small fire, clung to his buckskins. He secured her to his back, a familiar weight now, but one fraught with a new kind of dread. Each step away from the sheltered alcove where they'd spent the night felt like severing a cord. The canyon walls, still cloaked in shadows, offered no judgment, only silence. His gaze swept the landscape, memorizing the familiar contours of the land he was leaving behind. The desert, his home, was now a dangerous labyrinth for them both. His horse, a sturdy pinto named Ka, nickered softly, sensing the shift in Chaitin's demeanor. He stroked the animal's neck, the coarse mane a comforting texture beneath his fingers. "Easy, old friend," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "A long journey ahead." The first rays of sun lanced across the mesa, illuminating the trail he intended to follow. A faint game path winding north, away from the familiar hunting grounds, towards the distant, hazy outline of the mountains where the white men had built their settlement. A knot of apprehension tightened in his stomach. He'd seen their camps, their wagons, their faces etched with a fear he couldn't comprehend, a fear that turned into suspicion and sometimes violence. Ilara stirred against his back, a tiny whimper escaping her lips. Chayton paused, his heart constricting. He hummed a low, wordless tune, a melody his grandmother used to sing, and felt her settle once more. He had to be quick, silent, and invisible. The risk wasn't just to himself, it was to her, this tiny creature who had somehow burrowed into the hardened shell of his solitude. He stopped at a small rock formation, a natural shrine where he often left offerings. This time, he placed a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a gift from his father. It was a silent prayer, a plea to the spirits of the land to guide and protect them. As he turned to continue, a flash of movement caught his eye. A lone coyote, lean and watchful, stood silhouetted on a ridge, its gaze fixed on him. A chill ran down his spine. Was it a good omen? Or a warning? He pressed on, the silence of the desert now a heavy cloak, each creak of his saddle, each rustle of dry brush, amplified in the profound quiet of their departure. The town, with its unknown dangers and its promise of a future for Ilara, loomed large in his thoughts, a beacon he was compelled to follow, despite the gnawing fear that clung to him like desert dust.